president was very serious in his threats as early as this morning, using very strong language. Up until the last half hour, he had an 8 p.m. deadline. To get some better insight into what happens next, what we can keep our eye on, I spoke to retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General Robert Ashley. President Trump really ramping up his threats against Iran, but we know that rhetoric is far from the full picture, right? What's said publicly and what's happening privately are often two different things. As the clock approaches his 8 p.m. deadline, who is in the room with him, and what kind of intelligence or advice is he getting?
Yeah, I think the people that are in the room with him at this point will be the Secretary of War, will be the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Senator Rubio in his capacity as the National Security Advisor. I think the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency will be there, and possibly the Director of National Intelligence.
And what kind of advice or intelligence is he getting that can guide the conversation?
So if you take kind of that hyperbolic statement of we're going to eliminate this civilization, so the chairman's responsibility is to talk to the president about, okay, here are the targets, here are the options, and here's the potential outcomes. Now, you mentioned my time at the Defense Intelligence Agency. What DIA does is they have responsibility to understand all the infrastructure inside Iran. And so what they can map out is, if you want to darken this part of the country, these are the targets you have to hit. And then the question is, how many of those can they feasibly hit over one period of darkness, the strike tonight, and what's the effect that they want to achieve? So the chairman is going to give the president a series of options of potential impacts and targets, and then he can choose from those options.
Iran has threatened retaliation. Today, the Iranian envoy said Tehran will, quote, take immediate and proportionate action if Trump follows through on attack threats. I immediately thought of all of the men and women from the 82nd Airborne who were recently deployed to the Middle East. How are you thinking about what their role in all of this might be?
So, the 82nd is there in place to give the president options. To your first statement with regards to what the Iranians may do, they've been very clear that if we go after electric infrastructure, power infrastructure, that they're going to respond symmetrically. So they're going to take a symmetric approach against those kinds of facilities and installations across the Gulf Cooperation Council nations. So they're going to strike similar targets, and there's still the options of asymmetric threats. We've already seen them go after some cyber targets. There's still a global threat of terrorist activity and the fact that they could reach out to target officials in the United States. For the 82nd, they are only prepared to execute whatever the president has, whether that is to go to Karg Island, whether that is to go to some of the smaller islands around the Straits of Hormuz, or just to be a defensive capability to provide additional reinforcement to some of the bases that are in the Gulf region.
Critics say that what Trump is threatening could be a war crime. Canada's prime minister said, quote, Canada expects all parties in this conflict, in any conflict, to respect international laws. That means not targeting civilians or civilian infrastructure. But, Trump said in January in a New York Times interview, I don't need international law. I'm curious what you make of the rhetoric about international law. How much is that a factor in the private conversations among top members of the military?
Yeah, so not a lawyer by trade, but what I can tell you unequivocally is that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is very familiar with the law of armed conflict, the distinction between military and civilian targets, and the military necessity to strike particular targets. And so in those conversations that we talked about at the beginning, behind closed doors, the chairman will lay out what are legal and illegal targets for the president, but ultimately it will be the president to decide what targets he wants to strike.
Bob Ashley, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ashley.
So a brief sigh of relief as Iran agrees to this 2-week ceasefire. Delicate ceasefire agreement. Let us know what else you want to talk about when it comes to the war with Iran. Send an email to 7 p.m. at WRAL.com. Which parts of this story do you want to see covered on the news? Tell us what's on your mind, and we'll talk about it here at 7 o'clock.